Welcome back to Drilled. I'm Amy Westerveld. Today we are interrupting our False Solutions series to bring you an episode of our sister podcast, Damages, which is focused on climate litigation. That's because, I don't know if you've heard, but there's some big stuff that's been happening at the Supreme Court the last few weeks. A lot of it impacts climate. And I wanted to talk to someone who might make us all feel a little bit better about there still being some legal options for climate accountability. That person is Aaron Regenberg, Senior Climate Policy Counsel for Public Citizen. Public Citizen has recently been talking about the idea of filing criminal charges against oil companies related to climate change. One of those charges is homicide. That's right, homicide. I asked Regenberg to walk me through their thinking on that charge and other criminal charges, how using criminal law might help with the giant brick wall facing us at the Supreme Court, and what some of the most recent Supreme Court rulings mean for climate accountability. That conversation is coming up after this quick break.
Hey, it's Ryan Reynolds here from Mint Mobile. Now, I was looking for fun ways to tell you that Mint's offer of unlimited premium wireless for $15 a month is back. So I thought it would be fun if we made $15 bills. But it turns out that's very illegal. So there goes my big idea for the commercial. Give it a try at mintmobile.com/switch.
Upfront payment of $45 for 3-month plan, equivalent to $15 per month required. New customer offer for first 3 months only. Speed slow after 35 gigabytes if network's busy. Taxes and fees extra. See mintmobile.com.
This episode is brought to you by Greenlight. Get this. Adults with financial literacy skills have 82% more wealth than those who don't. From swimming lessons to piano classes, us parents invest in so many things to enrich our kids' lives. But are we investing in their future financial success? With Greenlight, you can teach your kids financial literacy skills like earning, saving, and investing. And this investment costs less than that after-school treat. Start prioritizing their financial education and future today with a risk-free trial at greenlight.com/Spotify. Greenlight.com/Spotify.
So I want to talk about the homicide stuff first and just have you tell me when you started looking at the viability of could this actually be a homicide charge against these companies and what started you off thinking in that direction?
The work that Public Citizen, my organization, is doing on this really comes from a place of just knowing that we're in 5-alarm fire mode, right? We're in throw everything at the wall mode. We need to be exploring every possible solution, every possible tool that we have for protecting folks from climate harms, for holding the actors responsible for this crisis accountable. And there's this whole big part of the law, a really important, powerful part, the criminal law, that I think has not really been brought to bear on this crisis. Again, we're getting to a point where the harms are really clear, right? The injuries, the deaths that we're seeing, it's getting harder and harder to ignore. And when you have people dying and you have particular individuals, particular corporate actors who have recklessly acted in ways that have caused or contributed to those harms, we have a word for that, and it's homicide. We're looking, to be clear, actually, at a number of possible criminal offenses that we think these companies, big oil, could potentially be charged with, though homicide is the most high profile and just, I think, important and severe given the stakes. And I think that this work becomes even more important considering the larger context. I guess we'll probably talk about the Supreme Court term later on in this conversation. But a lot of our tools are getting taken away or whittled away. And I think we all know that the criminal law in this country has for a long time, maybe always, been disproportionately targeted against poor people, people of color. But ostensibly, what it's supposed to be about protecting us from harm, right? Keeping us safe from dangerous actors that would do harm in our communities. And so the question we've been asking is, what if we use this system to actually protect us from harm, to actually protect us from the corporate actors that right now are doing damage at an almost unimaginable scale?
Could you actually run through the list of potential criminal offenses that you're looking at?
Yeah, absolutely. So as far as the sort of range of criminal offenses that we're looking at, that we're in conversations with prosecutors of various sorts about, there's offenses like reckless endangerment. So most states have some sort of reckless endangerment statute that says if you engage in reckless conduct that creates a substantial and unjustifiable risk of injuring or killing someone, then you have committed that crime. Similarly, some states, 5 or 6 states, actually have, it's kind of perfectly suited to what we're seeing, make it a crime to cause or risk catastrophe, which is, it's sort of similar, but at a larger scale to reckless endangerment. And it's kind of hard to imagine a more apt description of what big oil has done than caused or risked catastrophe. There's conspiracy and racketeering, which can be a component of a lot of different prosecutions. There's obviously fraud, and there could be civil fraud, but there's also criminal fraud in many states based on what they said versus what they knew. There's some antitrust statutes have criminal components, and we think, anti-competitive practice is a pretty good way of describing engaging in massive fraud and cover-up, specifically in order to keep potential competitors, i.e. renewable energy sources, out of the market. So that just kind of gives you an idea. There is a range. But having said that, I do think that homicide really does get at a lot of the moral corruption of what big oil has done. And you think about the kind of incidents and the kind of people that we do charge with homicide in this country. My wife's a public defender, so I hear stories every day. She had a client earlier this year who was driving in her car totally soberly with her fiance and got in a crash, and she was badly injured. Her fiance was killed. So her life's like already ruined. And then the local DA slaps her with a reckless homicide charge. It was a horrible case, and my wife won, but it was like a year and a half of this woman's life additionally ruined. The point is, like, we charge a lot of folks with homicide for conduct that is orders of magnitude less culpable and less harmful and disastrous than what big oil has knowingly done. And we're now seeing the body count going up in real time every day from climate disasters, whether it's hurricanes, whether it's the kind of extreme heat waves that so many of us are currently sweating under, whether it's wildfires. We could go on. We just put out a report looking at, just as one example, Maricopa County, its experience last year with the July heat wave. And there were well over 400 heat deaths in that county in July, which is more than the number of overall murders that the city experiences, right? If someone were pressing a killer heat button, I think law enforcement would be all over trying to stop them. That's not how we've thought about these killer heat waves. We think of them as these natural disasters, but we know, right, that they're not natural. Right. In many cases, we have studies saying that they would have been virtually impossible but for human-caused climate change. And we know who is behind human-caused climate change.
If a homicide charge were to be brought, it would have to be brought against particular individuals, not against a corporate entity. Is that true?
Individuals and corporations can be charged criminally. And indeed, there's a long history of corporations being charged with offenses like homicide. BP pled guilty to manslaughter for the Deepwater Horizon.
That's right. I forgot about that
disaster. One more recent example that we think is really interesting: PG&E Utility in California was convicted of negligent homicide for the Paradise Fire several years ago in California, and I think that's a really interesting example because
that's so interesting. Wow.
What they were found, the culpable behavior there that was found to have caused those deaths was their negligent upkeep of equipment that ended up causing the spark that led to that fire. But you take one step back, and
Right.
in the normal time, right? I think that fire was in October, November. Normally there would have been rain, many times over the previous months. That spark would have not led to a raging inferno that killed dozens and dozens of people. The reason that fire happened was what Exxon and Chevron and BP and Shell have done.
Right.
And so again, it's, you take one step back and you think about who's really responsible for those deaths. So anyway, you asked about individual versus corporation. So you could pursue both. Most of our focus is really looking at the corporate entities, both because there are some legal reasons why we think that could be a stronger case. And because as far as remedies go, I think, the project is less about, throwing people in jail and more about how do we get to the root issue of the problem. And so think the kinds of solutions that could come out of this that could actually shift those root causes. One good example of that kind of remedy, the DOJ's criminal settlement with Purdue Pharma for its role in the opioid crisis includes a plan to restructure Purdue as a public benefit corporation that is, explicitly focused in its corporate charter on repairing the harm it did, investing in public health solutions to the opioid crisis. And so, that's one vision for, you have a strong enough case and you could potentially get to a solution where we're rewriting a charter to say this company needs to focus on the clean energy transition. Though there's lots of other remedies that you could envision that could come either from a criminal settlement because the company's like, we don't want to go through this, or, they do go through it and there's a conviction and then there's a court order.
Right. Actually, I wanted to ask you about the opioid stuff, because I know people are kind of constantly saying, why aren't the climate cases like the opioid cases? And I know that a lot of those cases leaned on municipal code and this idea that the opioid epidemic was increasing costs for cities, which is certainly the case with the climate situation. And I know that some of the liability cases are getting at that. Could you walk me through how these charges would be different?
Yeah, so it's really interesting and important to think about the difference between, the civil suits and civil law in general and criminal law and these criminal charges that we've been proposing. And the first thing to say is in no way is anything that we're saying to say that, we should be talking about criminal instead of civil. The climate accountability suits, I think, are the most important thing happening right now in climate litigation. And they're actually, several of them are actually getting past the jurisdictional phase into discovery. Like they're starting to bear real fruit. And that is unbelievably exciting. So that's, we're just saying we need to be looking at everything. And there are advantages to criminal law. There's advantages to the speed. I mean, criminal cases move a lot faster. There's advantages to discovery. The state has some advantages there that a private plaintiff does not. And there's advantages to the actual law. Again, you think about how civil law has developed. It is big corporations who are usually the defendants, right? And so they have been for decades,
right,
all the power and best, big law lawyers in the world to make it as hard as possible to hold civil defendants accountable, as many sort of off-ramps, as many ways for judges to throw out cases before you actually get to trial. On the criminal side, you think about who's developed the law, right? It's overwhelmingly poor people, people who, I mean, again, my wife's a public defender, some great representation, but it's not people who have had the capacity to do that same kind of work. And so in a lot of ways, I mean, there's more deference to the judge in a criminal trial generally. It's harder to throw something out before you actually get to trial. And I think we saw in the Trump trial, there can be something really powerful about putting these questions in front of a group of 12 regular people who are tasked with making a common sense decision based on what they think is fair and just about, is it right to hold this person or actor responsible for this harm. There's a lot of systems that protect the rich and powerful and corporations in this country from accountability for the horrible things they do. And there's a lot of ways in which that process that I just described cuts through a lot of those systems.
What would you have to prove? What evidence would you have to bring to the table?
We just partnered with a former DOJ prosecutor. Her name's Cindy Cho. She's spent her career doing these kinds of complex prosecutions. And we partnered with her to do what's called a pros memo or a prosecution memo. It's basically the exercise a prosecutor does when they're deciding, is there enough evidence here to actually pursue a case, looking at a particular climate crisis and the evidence around it and trying to decide, analyze, is there a there? And by the way, the conclusion, and it wasn't just us, again, it was this longtime DOJ prosecutor, was that, there is enough here. So to prove a homicide charge, basically the two elements in a reckless homicide, in some states it's called manslaughter, sometimes it's called second-degree murder, is one, that the defendant caused a death, so that's the causation piece, and two, that they had the appropriate culpable mental state in their causing of the death. And so that's what sort of grades the level of homicide charge. So from the lowest, negligent homicide, so you acted negligently, that caused a death. The highest is, first degree murder, and that's where you acted with, intent. So we're not arguing that, right? Exxon was not doing what it did in order to kill the dozens of people that have died in this recent round of heat waves. But as far as reckless endangerment, acting recklessly, that's acting with knowledge of the risk, but doing it anyway. Or for a lot of different second degree murder charges, you need to show that they acted with extreme indifference to human life. Mm-hmm. So those are what we're really looking at. And so,
God, I'm just imagining them mounting an insanity defense.
So we did in this memo, prosecution memo, we did go through the different defenses that they're likely to raise and sort of, analyze the strength of them. Real quickly on those two elements. So on the mental state, on acting either recklessly or with extreme indifference to human life, often in a criminal prosecution, that's the hardest thing to prove because it's hard to sort of get in someone's head. In this situation, that's actually, I think, very doable, right? We have just mountains of evidence in these companies' internal memos showing that they exactly, you've reported on this to such wonderful efficacy. They knew exactly what they were doing. They were predicting, to the decimal point of temperature increase. They were talking about disasters. They're talking about sea level rise. They're talking about extreme heat. I was just looking at a report from 1996 that Exxon had really describing exactly in detail the kind of excess deaths from heat extremes that we're seeing right now. So anyway, to show that they knew that there was a risk at the very least, and that they went ahead anyway, we think that's very doable. The more, just to be frank, difficult piece of this is the causation. So to show causation in a case like this, you really need to prove it, and you need to prove it beyond a reasonable doubt, which is the higher standard for a criminal prosecution, at three different stages, right? So you need to show, one, that this particular event, this particular extreme weather event, whether it's an extreme heat wave or something else, caused this particular death. And we think that's pretty doable. There's a lot of public departments of health, boards of medical examiners, they will report this was a death due to extreme heat. Then you need to prove that this extreme weather event was caused by climate change. And again, that's the area where the rapidly developing climate attribution science is so important. Climate scientists can now say that this disaster was made X times more likely, was made X times more powerful, or would have been virtually impossible but for climate change. And I think it's particularly interesting in the context of, again, I'm really hot right now, I'm sweating, so thinking a lot about extreme heat. But in an extreme heat wave, the human body has clear thresholds, right, below which you can survive, and above which you get 1 or 2 degrees above that threshold, and you die. And so to show that climate change even caused this particular margin that went above that threshold, that shows that caused the death. So anyway, that's the second stage. And then the third stage, probably the The biggest is showing that these particular companies, and again, we're looking at at the biggest investor-owned oil and gas companies, the big names, Exxon, Chevron, BP, Shell, ConocoPhillips, etc., that they cause climate change. And that's one important thing to note. In most states and most jurisdictions, causation does not require you to have been the sole cause, or even in many cases the primary cause. You need to have been a substantial factor in contributing to that death. And so we think, again, there's plenty of evidence that a group of particular big oil companies has been a substantial factor in causing climate change, both through the actual physics of the emissions, right? We have source attribution research that can say this company is responsible for generating this percentage of all of human caused greenhouse gas emissions, since the beginning of the Industrial Revolution. And then also through their climate disinformation and deceit. And we think there's a causative argument there that what these companies did specifically in order to delay or block climate action has meant that climate change is worse, is farther along than it otherwise would have been. So you add those two together, and we think there's a pretty strong argument that these companies substantially contributed to climate change, that climate change, substantially contributed to this weather event, and then that this weather event caused. And we think that the victims of these disasters and their families deserve justice just as much as the victims of any street level crime. We spend a lot of time talking about justice for people who've been wronged, but we don't think about all the people being harmed from climate in the same way. And I think
Right.
it's time that we start doing that.
You touched on this a minute ago, and I want to ask you more about it. How does this help with this giant brick wall that we're facing with the Supreme Court right now?
Yeah, I mean, really, dark times in the law. The TLDR of this last term and lots of terms before, but certainly what we just saw in the last month is that it's been made a lot harder for the federal government to pursue the kind of regulatory actions that we need to solve climate. And so for us, that means it is even more important that we are exploring other tools, exploring other areas of the law that could have a big impact on this. And again, criminal law it's sort of half the law of this country, and it hasn't really been brought to bear. Another important piece we think about the value of these kinds of prosecutions that they could bring is it is a lot harder, I think, for the federal courts to step in when you're talking about a core police power of a state. We've been looking, we haven't been able to find a single case where a criminal law of general application, let alone a homicide prosecution, was preempted by the federal courts, right? Because again, that is a core power of states and localities, that they have control of criminal law. And it's not to say that, the Supreme Court has made clear that they don't give a shit about what the law actually is. And so it's not to say that they would not be able to make up new law from whole cloth in order to try to stop something like this. But certainly it's a lot harder, right? They would have to make it up from whole cloth. This is a core state and local jurisdiction thing. And there's no precedent for the federal courts coming in and taking it and squashing it. So, to the degree we can use the courts on climate, we think this is one of the ways to ensure that states and localities actually can have a voice. Because again, there's nothing more core to a local DA than being able to prosecute homicides that occurred in their jurisdiction.
Yeah. Okay. Shifting gears, I want to ask your thoughts on Supreme Court stuff as well. So, God, where to begin? Can I have you give me your sort of quick and simple explanation of the impact of chucking Chevron deference?
Yeah, it's not good. I mean, it's the the quick and dirty of the Chevron decision is that it is another massive judicial power grab. It is taking an immense amount of power out of the hands of actual experts in administrative agencies, people who have been doing whatever work, whether it's on environment, whether it's on health and medicine, whether it's on economics, whatever it is. We've got a lot of smart people in government. They've been doing this their whole careers. We are saying they don't get to decide anything, even if Congress has very clearly said, you get to decide this. And we're putting that power in the hands of, frankly, some of the worst and dumbest people in the world. And I'm talking about like 25-year-old law school grad, like FedSoc twerps. These are the law clerks, conservative justices who write the actual opinions. I clerked for a judge. These are the people who write the opinions. And these are kids who went right from college to law school, did not do anything in law school to open their minds, right? They spent the whole time in conservative FedSoc circle jerk meetings. And then they're asked to they're given the power to make these immense decisions about the environment and economics and health and occupational safety and everything else, having zero expertise. I went to law school with these people. They're not smart. They're not good. And they don't have that capacity to do good analysis on any of these questions. It's a big problem. I will say the optimist in me on the throwing Chevron in the garbage is I have some hope that it won't be as sort of cataclysmic as I think some people predict. And it's not super reassuring why that would be, but the reason why is that things are already so bad. I mean, the Supreme Court's major questions doctrine, I think has already destroyed much of the capacity of agencies.
I was going to ask you about that because it did really seem to me like there was all this uproar about Chevron deference. And while that was all going on before the ruling, I was kind of like, it feels like they've already achieved a lot of this with the major questions doctrine stuff and the extent to which they're leaning on it. But yeah, what are the additional issues beyond what major questions doctrine was already doing that this accomplishes?
No, I think that's absolutely right. They have already mostly accomplished this. And Chevron, I think it has been relied on less by agencies because we win some, we lose some, but we often have already lost those cases, those arguments. I actually think more impactful, arguably, in a really horrific way, is the statute of limitations. The other big, agency action case, Corner Post, that was decided the last day of the term. And so the opinion there was basically throwing aside the statute of limitations for challenges to government action. So there's a 6-year statute of limitations on challenging agency action. And what the Supreme Court interpreted is that 6 years does not start when the government action occurs. It starts whenever the injury happens. So basically that throws open the door to challenging literally any administrative action at all. So I think the potential for being wildly destabilizing of everything we have that protects our health and our water and our air from that decision is arguably more concerning than Chevron.
That's interesting. In terms of what can be done and how all of this dovetails with what's happening around electoral politics right now too, because the Supreme Court and the, likelihood of justices retiring and then being replaced by very young far right justices and all of that is the thing that I'm seeing talked about the most as sort of you have to vote for Biden no matter what because of the Supreme Court. So yeah, I'm curious for your thoughts on the packing the court stuff that people talk about when these rulings come out, and then also all of this kind of feeds into what's happening with the election.
Well, I think any Democrat who's not serious about court reform, including court expansion, is like either blind or, I mean, this is existential threat. They just ruled that Donald Trump can literally get away with murder.
Yeah, actually, I found that ruling to be so much more shocking than the Chevron deference stuff. And I was like, wow. I feel like this is basically saying we're not a democracy anymore.
I don't think you can overreact to it. It is so profoundly terrifying. I mean, they literally...
Yeah.
They literally say, this is a literal question. Can you order SEAL Team 6 to assassinate a rival? And it is pretty clear in that opinion that they are saying you can.
And especially getting that in the context of him really ramping up the rhetoric around revenge as part of his goal for re-election is, I don't know, it's very concerning.
It's really scary. I think that there are leaders in the Democratic Party on this. I think overall the Democratic Party has completely fallen on its ass on this. Whether it's Biden's refusal to engage in a real way, whether it's Dick Durbin's refusal to act like he's the chair of Senate Judiciary and has actual powers. I mean, the whole idea of constitutional interpretation just being the role of the judiciary is a new idea. Judicial supremacy is a new thing, and we've seen the playbook for how you deal with it. So FDR, he comes in, Great Depression, and he does his first round, the first New Deal it's called, of programs, and there's a conservative Supreme Court, and they basically bat them all down, they eviscerate them. And FDR does not, like Biden has, go out and say, well, that's not the role for the president, we got to respect what they say. FDR goes on a full-on, whistle-stop tour. He says, this is what we're fighting for, these things that'll help improve your lives. And these are the jackasses that are taking it away from you. It's bullshit. And proposes a number of different fixes. We think about his, quote unquote, court packing plan and that it was not successful. But we've totally drawn the wrong historical lesson there. He did this all-out front against the Supreme Court, and though the court expansion plan was not passed, the overall effect of that larger offensive was that the Supreme Court backed off, and the second New Deal set of programs was allowed to continue, and it was for our entire state and system of government. The Democratic Party has not done that. We have needed to start doing that decades ago, and It's really clear now.
Totally. The Democratic Party, or like I'll hear, political strategists be like, well, sure, that worked in FDR's day, but the Supreme Court wouldn't respond to that kind of pressure today. I mean, maybe, but could we try? I don't understand what seems to be total lack of energy or interest in doing anything at all about it.
It's indefensible.
Yeah.
And again, it's everything. The Supreme Court is threatening and has the ability to further threaten every single thing we care about. They've already obviously destroyed some of the most important rights that Americans have.
Right.
If you're not serious about this, I don't know how you can say you're serious about any of the issues we care about.
Right.
The last thing I'd say is, again, it's more reason for us to be looking for alternative solutions for how the law can keep our communities safe from climate harms and climate criminals. And we think that the criminal law is a way that localities and states can take action on the area that they have the strongest jurisdiction and right to say this is our core powers.